Hey guys, it's Jordan with your weekly Oakwood Student Ministry video. As always, I hope you're doing very well. We're in week 4 of our series, Vibes. We're going to finish it out. In this series, we've been talking about our emotions, our vibes, and how if we're not careful, they can take control of us. As I start this last message, I want to ask you a question. Here it is. What would you do if you knew you would never get caught and there'd be no consequences for your actions? Let me say that again. What would you do? Think about this. If you could do whatever you want, you would never get caught and there'd be no consequences for those actions. Now, what would you think if I asked you to go tell somebody what you just thought, right? You might be embarrassed. Some of the things that come to mind when I ask myself that question surprise me. It gets kind of dark at times. It's like, thank goodness nobody is a mind reader around me. We all have the potential to have some wild and dark thoughts. We're also smart enough not to often talk about it, right? We keep that stuff tucked inside. We're experts at monitoring our behavior, for the most part, not letting that kind of stuff come out. And while we've learned to monitor our behavior, here's the problem, here's where we're going. The problem is we haven't learned to exactly monitor our emotions, the stuff going on inside of us, our hearts, where it all comes from. And we talked about this. This affects you. This affects everyone around you. And Jesus cares deeply about you and those relationships. So this is why I think King Solomon in the Old Testament, book of Proverbs, he said this, Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Solomon's saying what's going on inside of you is important. Why? Because everything you do, whatever comes out of you, it comes from your heart. You can all try to watch our actions, monitor our behaviors, but it's really what's going on inside of here that's the problem. The real problem, whether good or bad, it's going to come out. It's going to show eventually. We can all admit we have some problems inside, right? And most of us can quickly think of things we've done, we've said, we've thought that nobody else knows about. It's our own thing. Maybe it's just up here, things we're feeling. And no one else can know about it. That's ours, and we hold it inside. And it's not great. And when that comes out, man, it's really bad, right? Because people get to see how awful we can be. And when that happens, we feel an emotion that we're going to talk about today. And that emotion is guilt. When you cross the line, you do something, you say something, you expose something about yourself that you're ashamed of, we feel guilty. Now, that's a loaded word because there's different versions of guilt. There's false guilt, where you just feel guilty for something you haven't done or something that wasn't that big of a deal, and for whatever reason, you just kind of have that personality. That's not what I'm talking about. Get help for that. Let's talk about that as well, but that's not where we're going. I'm talking about real, actual guilt for something I did or you did that we deserve to feel bad about. We should feel guilty. That's what we're talking about today. Now, I don't know what it was. I don't know what the many things are that you did that you shouldn't have done, or said that you shouldn't have said, or thought that you shouldn't have thought. But feeling guilty about that isn't in itself a bad thing. It becomes a problem when you let that become part of your identity and it just owns you. Now, nobody likes to feel guilty. Let's make that clear. Instead of doing something about it, though, we stuff it away. And we have these messages we tell ourselves, like, well, I wasn't the only one doing it, or I was going through a phase, or my favorite, just the blanket statement, it wasn't my fault. It just wasn't my fault, right? Somehow it's somebody else's fault. They should feel guilty about what I did, not me. And we tell ourselves these stories so we feel less guilty, so the guilt has more power. But the problem is when we don't deal with it, when we don't own it, when we make excuses and pretend it's not a big deal, it doesn't go away. The guilt just gets more powerful. Let me tell you why. Here's all the bad news around this thing of guilt. Guilt creates a debt and debtor relationship with the person we've wronged. It's like an IOU out of the relationship. Why? Because you've taken something from them. I don't know what it is. Maybe you just actually stole. You took their wallet. I don't know. But more emotionally, you take their reputation. You could take their trust, you take their self-esteem, whatever it is, that you took something from them. And so you feel guilty because you wronged them in a way. And so Oh, by the way, with that, this is why we say things like, I owe them an apology. Like, we just admit it. I owe them something. I've wronged them. I've taken something, and I owe them something back. So we also experience this debt like a weight around our shoulders. We carry it around until we can feel like we've made it right somehow. And it throws us off balance. The weight of guilt will really throw you off balance. And this is why we even say things when we feel like we've righted the wrong or we came clean. I feel like a weight has been lifted from my shoulders. We use language like that because this guilt becomes a weight. The other thing is it transfers, sin splatters. And so it's one of the tricky things about guilt. You might get in a fight with your mom, your dad, your brother or something, and you go to school and you're in a bad mood. And you kind of carry that frustration. And now you're not just, if they were in the wrong, but the part where you were in the wrong. When you behaved and said things you shouldn't have. You carry it with you into other relationships. And then lastly, I found this to be so true in my life. When I have guilt that I'm not dealing with, not only have I know I've wronged somebody and I'm in a debt relationship, I hate that. I have this weight hanging off my shoulders. I'm in a bad mood about it. I'm struggling in my head. I'm exhausted about what I've done. It's becoming part of my identity. And then I get angry. And we go right back to anger. And we know one thing about anger, that definitely doesn't just stay inside. That eventually comes out and affects everyone around us. And we're angry at behaving the way we did, and we're angry because we can't let it go. We're just hanging on. We talk to ourselves and say things about ourselves that aren't good because of it. So, that's a lot of bad about guilt. And here's the thing. We're all guilty. We are all guilty and we know it. We've all sinned. And so we're in danger of letting this guilt turn to anger, be a weight, affect every relationship around us. We don't like people pointing it out. We get pretty hacked off about that. Because if they do, we have to own our guilt and we have to see it for what it is. Sin. It's sin. And that leaves us feeling condemned, convicted, judged. We feel bad because we did bad. We can't unsay it. We can't untalk it. We can't undo it. And so what do we do at that point? Eventually, we realize even though this thing is in the past, it's part of my story. It's part of who I am. It's part of my legacy, what I've done. That is a lot of bad about guilt. And I need to set that up because the good actually outweighs it. And it's amazing. Here's the good news. You can get this weight off your shoulders. You can avoid the cycle of despair. You can keep this from becoming your identity. You can stay away from the anger. You can own it and you can move forward free. How do you do that? Well, glad you asked. Jesus offers another way. He offers another way. You don't have to be controlled by guilt, shame, or anger. And that's what we're going to go to our Bibles and talk about for the next few minutes. Okay, so to make this point, I want to look at something the Apostle Paul said. And it's really important that we highlight who said this. Because Paul had more reason to have guilt, shame, and regret than any of us. Paul carried a burden and a weight of guilt around, I'm sure, at times. Because he wasn't just a preacher trying to make a point here. Paul lived this, what he's going to tell us. And he was ashamed of his past and felt guilty beyond what you can imagine. Why? Well, because of the early part of his life. Before he was Paul the Apostle, the great missionary, the great evangelist, the great Jesus follower, and he was, and this is a guy we should aspire to be like. Before he was Paul the Apostle, he was known as Saul of Tarsus. What did Saul of Tarsus spend his time doing? Hunting down Christians, hunting down followers of Jesus in the early church so he could arrest them, have them tortured, imprisoned, and even killed. And he didn't just let this happen, he made this happen. Paul was bad to the bone, and he was hired to be a bounty hunter, basically, for Christians. So that's what Paul did. And then Paul's life changed radically, met Jesus in a really fun way, and he himself became a Jesus follower. So he changes and says, okay, instead of hunting them down, I'm going to help make Jesus followers. I'm going to help make Christians. I'm going to encourage them. I'm going to strengthen them. I'm going to tell them to spread this. And I'm on the other side now. He made it his life's mission until his dying breath to create Christians, encourage Christians with the love and grace of Jesus. But his past was still his past, and he likely had to face families of people he had arrested or killed. As he went to bed at night, I can imagine he saw the faces of people that he had wronged. That's heavy. So what makes this story so amazing? What did Paul figure out that we need to know? Well, Paul didn't distance himself from his past. He doesn't run away from it, doesn't try to hide it, doesn't deny it. He says flat out, that's who I was. That is. He doesn't make excuses. Well, that was before Jesus. No, none of that. Instead, he tells his story and he owns it. In fact, in the book of Romans, the first 7 chapters, a lot of that in there is Paul just telling his story. And he's also saying to us, the reader, and I know you, fallen, sinful human as you are, you got the same story I do. Your sin might be different, but you have it, and you're just as guilty as I am, and we're in a bad spot. And the first 7 chapters of Romans make you feel really bad because you're in a bad spot. And then we get to chapter 8, and this is what he says. Therefore, because of all this, though, but because of what Jesus has done, therefore, there is now no condemnation. There should be no guilt, no condemnation in there for those who are in Christ Jesus. Why? Because through Christ Jesus, the law of the Spirit who gives life has set you free from the law of sin and death. In other words, he says, because of what Jesus has done, something new has happened. It's changed everything. You don't have to pretend like you didn't do anything wrong. You can admit it. And there's freedom in just owning up to God and saying, I'm a sinner, I'm broken, I'm fallen. This is what I did. This is what I said. When you call it what it is, he says the weight comes off. Because ultimately, all sin is against God. When you go to God and you say to him, hey, I'm in debt to you, and you come to him, he forgives your debt. I don't know if you remember in the first Avengers movie, there's a line with Black Widow. She's doing all this work, trying so hard, and Hawkeye looks at her and says, basically, why are you doing this? She goes, I have read in my ledger. I'm in debt for the bad things I've done, and I'm trying to outdo it. And a lot of people spend their life, got read in my ledger, I've done all this wrong, I'm trying to outdo it, and it's impossible. We know who we are. We know we can't do more good than bad, sort of thing. And what Paul is saying here is you come to God and you say, I got read in my ledger, I'm messed up, I've done all this bad. God says, don't worry, I'll take care of it. I'm going to take it all away. I'm going to pay your debt for you. The weight comes off. You can stop running, stop making excuses. You can let it all go and find freedom in the grace of God. Paul tells us this. He goes on to say, for what the law was powerless to do for you. The law was powerless. And he says, this is all the law could do. It could show you that you were wrong. It's a pedagogy. It's a teacher. And it just points out that you stink and I stink. That's what the law does for us. Can't fix anything. Can't take the guilt away. It definitely doesn't give us freedom. Paul says, for what the law was powerless to do, because it was weakened by the flesh, God did. What the law couldn't do, God did. How? By sending his own son, Jesus, in the likeness of sinful flesh to be a sin offering. Here's what it means. It's the gospel. God made everything and it was good. We sinned. We separated ourselves. We got, read in our ledger. We're guilty. We're condemned. And then God sent his son, Jesus, to forgive us, to give us grace, to die in our place for our sins. Jesus had no guilt. He did nothing wrong. He came, he lived the perfect, sinless life. And then he went to die a criminal's death so you and I can have freedom. And we have every reason to feel guilty. We did those things. Jesus had no reason to feel guilty because he didn't do anything wrong. Yet Jesus is the one who died. But because of that, we no longer have to feel guilty because he says, as he's dying, he says, I'm dying for your sins. And in exchange, I'm giving you my perfection. In other words, guilt doesn't have to be the boss of you. Jesus is. Because Jesus looks at you and says, let me take your resume, your broken, sinful, guilty resume. Let me give you mine. You're perfect in the eyes of me, in the eyes of God. It sounds crazy, I know. But we can live guilt-free based on this truth. Jesus took it all, and he's saying, bring your guilt. Bring all that junk over here. Give it to me. Everything you've ever done. I want you to own it, but bring it to me. Now, what you did was wrong. It wasn't okay. There's consequences. We both agree. That's wrong. You messed up. You're guilty. But then he says, that's not the end of your story. I won't let that be the end of your story if you turn to me and accept my grace. He says, I don't see you that way anymore. And I don't want you to see yourself that way either. He says, I love you and I forgive you. Ultimately, you sinned against me and I paid your debt. You're forgiven. Paul wraps up this thought by saying this. And so he, God, condemned sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law might be fully met in us. The law says we should be punished, condemned. Jesus paid that price. So the law was fulfilled and we're free. In us who don't live according to the flesh, we don't live according to the flesh, according to the law, we don't have to play by those rules anymore. We live according to the Spirit, accepting the grace of Jesus. Paul's saying, listen, God made the relationship between you and him. If you accept the grace given by the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus Christ, if you accept that, you are guilt-free. Now, you're guilty because you did something you shouldn't have done, but you're not condemned. That guilt doesn't define you anymore. What Jesus did on that cross defines you. Jesus took the guilt on himself so you can be free. All right, so how does this help? Because I know Paul writes it in somewhat a confusing way. If you don't know the terminology, Christianese, it might get a little confusing. And I don't want you to miss this because of that. Here's the deal. When you decide to take God at his word, that he is who he said he is, and he's done for you what he's promised he's done, a few things will happen. And I found this to be true in my own life. So if you believe this, here's what's going to happen. Number one, you realize you are no longer allowed to condemn yourself or punish yourself. Guilt's not the boss of you. You belong to God. Ultimately, you sinned against him, and he looks at you and says, I love you and I forgive you. And your guilt is covered. Your sin is covered. Your debt is paid. So when you hear the voice of shame or guilt try to come in, weigh you down, you can say, hey, Jesus took care of that for me. Like, look to him. That's not who I am anymore. I'm a new creation in Jesus. Talk to him. C.S. Lewis said when he felt guilty, he'd ask himself, do I really think I'm a higher judge, a higher court over myself than God? Like, if God has ruled that I've been forgiven, I've been set free, why do I think I get to, under him, rule over me and say something different? And so, number one, you realize you are absolutely not allowed to condemn yourself anymore because he says you're forgiven. Done. And that just takes care of it right there in a lot of ways. And then number two, well, what do you do with that guilt and shame? Well, it says your guilt will remind you, not define you. Right? You did that thing. You said that thing. You have some lessons to learn. There'll be consequences because of your actions, but that's not who you are. Jesus defines who you are. So you can let your past be the thing that marks a change in your life, like catalyst to move forward. You can show gratitude to God for the grace he's given you and move forward in obedience, smarter, wiser, more patient, kind with those who are going through it. Again, your guilt will remind you of things, but it will not define you in who you are. Old pastor used to always say, look, I'm not yet who I want to be, but thank God I'm not what I used to be. Right? God's teaching me through my mistakes. It doesn't define me. Right? It can remind me to be better. So that's number one. You're no longer allowed to condemn yourself. Number two, that guilt and shame can be a teacher, as the law says, but it doesn't define you. It doesn't have to hold you down and weigh you down. It can help you to move forward wiser. Number three, when it comes to your relationships, you realize I actually don't have the ability to condemn others for their mistakes either. You realize what Jesus has done for you and your guilt, then you understand he's done the same thing for others. So you don't get to judge, you don't get to hate, you don't get to criticize. You have to forgive. This is what Jesus says all the time. Forgive as I've forgiven you. Your past mistakes and the grace you've received from Jesus give you a perfect position to love and give that grace to others who desperately need it. It's amazing. I remember when I was going through a really tough time, I thought I would never get past this roadblock with guilt and shame and internal stuff. I was talking to a pastor, and he just said, very coolly, as I'm like blubbering, crying, he says, one day, you are not only going to be past this, you're going to be helping others get past this. And I thought, you're crazy. I can't see 2 feet in front of me through this mess right now. And sure enough, here I am. As I preach, as I counsel, as I talk to people, as I pray with them, I'm helping them get through what I was going through. Most of it caused by me. And I'm smarter, I'm wiser, I know I'm forgiven. That crap didn't define me, it doesn't today. And I can talk about it boldly and help others, completely free from the shame and the guilt of it, because I know I've been forgiven. And now I get to help other people. I get to love other people. Even when they've done the same heinous, stupid things I've done, I can love and forgive them. You don't get to condemn others for their mistakes. Actually, you get to love and help them. Then number 4, you are free to make things right with the person you went and hurt, without excuses and without expecting to get something back from them. I mean, this is big. Sometimes when we sin, we think, oh, well, I did pray to God. I understand I'm in debt to him, and that's the end of it. No. God forgives you, and he wants you to make the first move and go talk to somebody else and set it right. Jesus cares about that too. So go ahead, pray for forgiveness, start there, but then go out and make things right with the other person. Whatever you took from them, trust, friendship, self-esteem, own it. And here's the thing. Maybe that humility, just going to them, is going to be the catalyst to fix everything in the first place. I found that to be so true. When I come to somebody and I say, hey, I just want to own it. I messed up. And I want to say I'm sorry. And I want to try to fix this. Usually that's all it takes. And they're going through stuff and they're processing things. And you can allow them to deal with the hurt and the emotion they're feeling in a different way. Because that can try to own them too. When they realize, hey, this guy, he's humbly sorry and he wants to try to make it right. A lot of times that frees them up in ways. So it's a gift you can give. Maybe that's why you're listening to this today. Someone's waiting for you to make the first move to help make things right. And that's the way you move forward. You take the weight of guilt off the relationship, off yourself. Don't let pride, fear, worry keep you from doing that. Might be the best thing you do is go to somebody and say, hey, bump the guilt vibe. We're going to play humility right now. We're going to set this thing right. Okay, I get this is scary. I get this is a lot to think to do. But remember, as long as we hold on to guilt, we're letting our past define us. And Jesus came to change that, to remind us that doesn't have to define us. In my marriage especially, I've realized, grace is the way forward. Because sin can either define this relationship or grace can. And let grace be it. Let the grace of God define this relationship and the guilt, and let your other relationships, let the grace of God define those relationships. My wife and I have matching tattoos. Greek word carries for grace as a reminder of just that idea. Maybe today's the day you finally understood the gospel. Understand what Jesus has done for you. There's no room for guilt, no room for condemnation, because he took it on himself to give you freedom. So be free. Don't walk in darkness. Don't walk in sin. Don't walk in condemnation. The enemy wants you to do that, wants to confuse you. You are free because of Jesus. That's the gift he gives you in this life and for eternity. We're blessed people. No room for the vice of guilt, shame, embarrassment, and pride, because Jesus, all that's gone. What a gift. And so as you head out, let that be a reminder to you. As you deal with your own guilt, give it to him, trust him that you're forgiven, you're no longer condemned, and you're free. And as you deal with others, love them with the same love and grace that Jesus gave you. Man, that's going to lead to some good things in life. Okay, I miss you. Hope you can come in person sooner rather than later, but otherwise we're here. We love you, and we'll talk to you soon. All right, bye.